Hello and welcome to another video from Sustenance and Covering on the channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's little video is going to be about how to hide your food. And as I said earlier, this is not going to be about the food that you got in your house, but the food that you got growing in your yard, because in the U.S. every law necessary to make growing your own food illegal has already been created, voted on, and passed into law. Nothing more is needed except for enforcement. If you doubt me on this, then just go ahead and continue putting your faith in the land of the free. Or if you have any common sense whatsoever, just go back and watch my video about why you should hide your food and take in a little truth. Once you're done watching that, and have figured out what the future holds for you and your loved ones, you can come back to this video and hopefully save yourself all the problems associated with getting caught committing a felony and serving time in the prison system, manufacturing such useful items as clothing and furniture. Trust me when I say that prison is not the place to be during the upcoming regime change. First things first, you do not want to start bringing your homegrown, fresh fruit and vegetables to the local farmer's market. This will only bring attention to yourself. I've been at the farmer's market when guys that are better dressed than the average farmer are walking around with little notebooks asking folks for their tax ID numbers. Obviously, that's not a good thing. And when the hammer drops, you can believe that someone else dressed even nicer will be knocking at your door. Everybody who produces food has a sense of pride that is so overwhelming that it's hard to keep it all in. We're humans. It's what we're made to do. We all want to tell everybody about the latest piece of fruit to come ripe, and what better way to do that than to spend time at the farmer's market with all them other like-minded folks. But trust me, the time for both bragging and money is over. If the farmer's market is your only source of income, then you can always just plant some fruit and nut trees in a hidden location. But you have got to keep some of your produce out in the open so that those who are going to be assigned the job of food control on a local level will not question where you're hiding your food. In the last century, a huge disconnect has occurred between human beings and their food. This is by design, but can work to your advantage unless, of course, you are one of those disconnected people. Most civilized people have been brought up to believe that producing and preparing food is something that only subhumans should have to do. That's why the people that are hired for these jobs are forced to leave their families behind, are not allowed citizenship, are barely paid, and usually have all of their possessions and money taken from them by law enforcement when they try to return home with their income. Here is a list that I have put together of some common truths about civilized people that you can use to your advantage. 1. Most people cannot recognize food that is not in a can, wrapped in plastic, or sitting in the produce department at the local grocery store. 2. Most people are able to recognize less than 3 varieties of trees or plants. 3. Most people cannot recognize any fruit tree unless it has fruit on it. 4. Many cannot recognize any fruit tree even when it does have fruit on it. 5. Most people who can recognize food-producing plants and trees are only familiar with those that are commercially viable. Plants and trees that meet this criteria make up less than half of the total amount of food-producing plants and trees that exist. 6. Most people who can recognize a fruit tree that is in the middle of a lawn cannot recognize that same fruit tree when planted next to other non-fruiting trees. This is just how the human mind works. 7. Most people cannot recognize a vegetable garden unless it is planted in rows or raised beds. 8. Most people cannot recognize any plants that produce their food below ground. 9. No civilized person is able to recognize any edible weeds, and if you show them an edible weed and even eat it right in front of them, they still will not eat it. This disconnect between human beings and their food will probably cost many their lives in the coming years, but can be a serious advantage to anybody that wishes to hide their food-producing trees and plants. Depending on your location, there may already be laws in place telling you how many food-producing plants you can legally have, or even if you are allowed to have any at all. The way that you plant things can counter these laws and sometimes even make your food plants completely undetectable. This can actually work in your favor if you can successfully figure out how to circumvent the laws now. When things get worse, you'll already be practicing illegal food production. If you live in a neighborhood that only allows one tree in your yard, then plant your tree wherever you feel comfortable. How or where you plant your tree isn't going to be an issue with your one tree. If you have a place to plant it that is out of the sight of your neighbors, I highly recommend that you choose this place. But if you're willing to stick your neck out and carefully read the rules pertaining to your neighborhood about fruit trees and be creative, sometimes the way you space your trees can circumvent the rules and actually disguise what you have. If you're only allowed one tree, please plant at least a $100 tree. Some fruit trees take a decade before they start producing fruit. And as bad as it might be to have only one fruit tree in your yard when the collapse comes, it could be much worse if that tree is still 3 years away from producing. If fruit trees are not allowed but hedges are, get yourself a book on bonsai and plant about a 100-foot row of closely spaced fruit trees. Just keep them pruned into the shape of a hedge. If the rules specifically prohibit anything that produces fruit, plant fruit trees. Just make sure to pick the fruit off before it is recognizable. Most people cannot tell a fruit tree from an ornamental tree unless they see fruit. So just don't let them see fruit. Now, I know that it might be difficult for you to throw away perfectly good fruit, but if you're planting fruit trees for survival, then throwing away a few years' worth of fruit is a small price to pay. It can allow you to keep a tree that you wouldn't otherwise be able to possess, while at the same time allowing the tree itself to become stronger and larger for future fruit production. If you think that throwing away the fruit won't fool people, know this. In my life, I have planted, pruned, watered, mulched, and cared for hundreds of fruit and nut trees, and even now I cannot tell a flowering pear from a fruiting pear. To me, the trees seem to be identical. If you pick all the little fruit buds off of your fruit and pear tree, instantly you have an ornamental pear tree, and nobody can tell you any different. Many commercial orchards pick and discard all of the first 2 or 3 years of fruit anyway, just to allow the tree to reach mature size quicker. The theory is that if the tree doesn't have to put out energy into fruit production, then all of the tree's energy will go into trunk and limb production. Plus, for the time being, you can walk into any supermarket and buy a sack of oranges for $10. That may seem like quite a bit of money to throw away every time you go shopping, but believe me, in the very near future, $10 will seem like nothing when a sack of oranges is over $100. If possible, you can always just leave some fruit on the side of the tree that your neighbors can't see. Or if you just can't bring yourself to throw away food, get yourself some of them camo-colored socks that they sell to hunters and cover your fruit with socks. You can probably get at least 6 fruit covers out of a pair, but be reasonable. A tree with 100 socks hanging from it isn't going to work. You could actually just pick your fruit before it ripens. It is true that most fruit is unpalatable and sometimes even poisonous when it is green, but nearly any fruit can be made edible simply by cooking it. There are even some fruits that taste better green. Commercially, limes are picked before they ripen because, for some reason, people prefer them that way. I prefer them when they're yellow, but probably any citrus can be picked and eaten when it is green. This is a good method for extending the harvest. Eating unripe fruit first, then eating ripe fruit, then later eating overripe fruit can extend the harvest into a year-round event. Another option for someone living in a neighborhood that doesn't allow fruit trees is growing oak trees. Even though oaks are considered shade trees, a mature one can produce over 1,000 pounds of fruit in a single year in the form of acorns. Enough to sustain the average family even if there is no other source of food available. The only problem is that it takes a long time for nut-producing trees to mature. The empire's falling fast, and there's no way to figure out how much time is left to grow an oak tree in preparation for the coming collapse. This suggestion will probably only work for someone that already has an established oak tree. Another way to hide the fact that you're growing food in your yard may be to just plant things that are no longer recognized as food because they are not commonly marketed in their natural condition. Trees like Japanese persimmons, figs, and pawpaws are too fragile to be transported or displayed. They begin to deteriorate rapidly as soon as they are harvested. Most people are just not familiar with these fruits because the only fruit that they have ever seen in real life is what regularly appears in the produce section of their supermarket. What if you're not allowed to have any trees or shrubs, but flowers and other ornamentals are allowed? Then plant every square inch of your lawn and canna lilies or any number of other edible flowers and ornamentals. You could even plant carrots and potatoes, since nobody knows what those look like because their food parts are underground. Over half of my food plants are not recognized as food by the vast majority of people. And if suddenly the government were to come in here and cut down all of my fruit trees, the supposed non-food plants and trees that they would leave behind would still be enough to sustain my family in an emergency. One thing that I have found on my own is that the mammoth elephant ear bulbs that they sell at the store look just like taro and taste just like taro. And taro is the primary staple food of a large part of the planet's population. If my elephant ears ever come up, I should be able to live off of that alone. And from just talking to local folks so far, I have found not one single person that would volunteer for a taste test. And one of the people that I asked is from Asia and has eaten taro all his life. You see, around here, people have been told for as long as I can remember that elephant ears are poisonous. It may one day soon get to the point where people are killing one another over food. But I'm reasonably sure that it'll never get to the point where people are killing one another over what they think is poison. That's a big psychological block that can work in your favor. Nobody will eat them, even if you offer them some. Of course, you could just go to the Asian market and purchase actual taro if you can find some that's not been, hasn't had the bottoms cut off of it. Anybody that spotted them will just think that you got elephant ears. So, once again, no one's going to steal your poison. If you do choose to plant edible landscaping plants such as daylilies or elephant ears, you can probably plant cucumbers and tomatoes right in there with them. Your unconventional food plants will usually camouflage your vegetables. It'll at least do so enough to make them virtually invisible. And since nobody knows what the visible parts of carrots and potatoes look like, you can use them the same way, as long as you plant them like a flower garden and not in rows. These ideas that I've been suggesting are mostly for folks that are forced into having standard issue lawns. This type of situation could make things a little more difficult for people that are subject to it. It isn't that you could never pull off having a lawn that produces food, but the fact is that you're going to face a few more challenges than someone living out in the woods. But sometimes hiding things in plain sight works better than any other method. Something else to keep in mind is that once gas reaches $10 a gallon, few people will continue to maintain a lawn. Many weeds that come up in an unkept lawn will be edible raw. Nearly all of them will be edible cooked. And a lawn that's knee-high and is pretty effective at hiding most vegetables that you may choose to plant as well. In my situation, even though I live inside the city limits, my house borders up against a very wet area that is considered too useless to develop. As a result, it is heavily wooded and is not clear to anybody but me where my property lines are. In other words, no one can force me to cut my grass because other than me, nobody really knows what my grass is. This is a very valuable resource. You see, not only can I use the wooded areas of my land to hide my food-producing trees and plants, but I also have almost unlimited stealth access to the 250 acres that surrounds my home. As far as I know, I'm the only homeowner in this area that has taken the initiative to cut trails out to the surrounding wooded areas. I have about 400 fruit and nut trees planted on my property. However, I also have about 200 more planted on 6 lots that I do not own. There is no easy way for anybody to access most of these trees without traveling across my land. If you have nowhere to plant anything, you should seriously think about planting off-site. If the New World Order elitists start taking possession of property that is found to have food on it the same way that they take possession of property that's found to have hemp growing on it, having your food growing on someone else's property can actually be a good thing. If you still aren't sold on the idea of America making real food illegal, well, that's okay. Even if you're one of them patriot types looking for a way to hide your food from out-of-control starving non-patriots, everything that I said about how to hide your food is a good idea. I still worry about someone stumbling onto my little paradise, but I've done all I can do to make my food-producing trees simply blend in, and that's all that anybody can do. Make your food blend in with the surroundings, no matter what your surroundings are. If your neighbors have lawns, make your food look like a lawn. If you live in a forest, make your food look like a forest. But if you believe that America is a just and righteous nation that would never take away a person's right to grow their own food, then I highly recommend that you plant everything you got in rows. You don't want to survive, don't listen to me.